London, 1997. Inside Kensington Palace, there were rooms that suddenly felt different. The furniture was still familiar. Photographs had not yet become historical objects. Drawers still contained the ordinary remains of a life interrupted without warning, and somewhere beyond those palace doors was a space Britain knew simply as Diana's home. For years afterward, a story would grow around those rooms, that Camilla Parker Bowles had once been prevented from entering them, that the instruction had come from Queen Elizabeth II herself, and that when someone quietly asked why, the Queen gave an answer no one had expected. There is a problem with that story. No reliable primary source has surfaced, proving that Queen Elizabeth literally stood at Diana's doorway, or personally ordered Camilla away from a particular room, but that does not mean the story appeared from nowhere, because something much larger and much better documented was happening. There really was a boundary, and for a period after Diana's death, Queen Elizabeth seemed determined that Camilla would not simply walk across it. Not because one bedroom belonged to Diana, because an entire chapter of royal history still did, and the people standing at the centre of that chapter were two boys who had just lost their mother. William was 15, Harry was 12. That changes the meaning of everything. When Diana married Prince Charles in July 1981, apartments 8 and 9 at Kensington Palace became their London home. It was not merely ceremonial space. William and Harry grew up there. There were school mornings, family photographs, staff moving through corridors, private conversations behind closed doors, and the ordinary disorder created when children turn an official residence into a home. Even after Diana and Charles divorced on August 28, 1996, Diana remained at Kensington Palace. She had lost the style of her Royal Highness, but she had not disappeared. Kensington Palace became more important than ever. It was the place from which she was beginning to construct a life that belonged increasingly to herself, and that distinction matters, because by then, Diana was no longer simply the unhappy wife of the future king. She was becoming something the institution had never quite learned how to manage. Independent, publicly adored, unpredictable, and increasingly willing to describe her own experience in her own words. On November 20, 1995, nearly 23 million people in Britain watched Diana's interview with Martin Bashir. Much about the way that interview was obtained would later become deeply controversial. But the words Diana spoke that night entered history immediately. She described loneliness. She discussed the breakdown of her marriage. And when asked about Camilla Parker Bowles, Diana gave the sentence that would define the triangle forever. There were 3 of us in this marriage. It was not simply gossip anymore. The Princess of Wales had said it herself. In that same interview, Diana spoke of believing that the royal establishment regarded her differently because she did not follow the expected rulebook. She said she led from the heart. She believed some within the institution considered her a threat. 1 month later, the Queen intervened. In December 1995, Buckingham Palace confirmed that Elizabeth had written separately to Charles and Diana, expressing the view that an early divorce was desirable. The marriage that had begun in St. Paul's Cathedral before hundreds of millions of viewers was finally being dismantled by letters. There is something almost painfully appropriate about that. A public fairy tale ended privately, on paper. Then came August 31st, 1997, Paris. A tunnel, a telephone call, and suddenly every calculation changed. Diana was dead at 36. There was no graceful transition. Before we continue, let us know in the comments, what city are you watching from, and what time is it there right now? And when the story is over, come back and tell us what you thought. We'd love to hear your honest review. Now, let's get back to the story. No final conversation, no opportunity for anyone inside the royal family to decide how the story should conclude, and Britain reacted with a scale of grief the monarchy had not anticipated. Outside Kensington Palace, flowers accumulated until the ground seemed to disappear beneath them. Messages were attached to gates. People cried beside strangers. The woman who had been divorced from the future king had somehow become even more powerful in death. She could no longer speak, yet millions believed they understood exactly what she represented. That created a problem no palace advisor could solve with protocol. How could Charles eventually build a public future with Camilla without appearing to erase the woman whose death had just produced one of the largest collective displays of grief in modern British memory? And how could the Queen respond not only as sovereign, but as grandmother? On September 5, 1997, Elizabeth addressed the nation from Buckingham Palace. Her language was carefully chosen, but listen to what she emphasized. She called Diana an exceptional and gifted human being. She praised her warmth, her commitment to others, and especially her devotion to William and Harry. That last part is important, because behind the constitutional crisis and the newspaper headlines were 2 children. Whatever Elizabeth privately thought about Diana's clashes with the institution, Diana remained their mother. No one could replace that. No one could rewrite it, and no new relationship in Charles's life could be allowed to pretend otherwise. This is where the legend of the Forbidden Room becomes emotionally revealing, even if its literal details cannot be proven. Imagine what Diana's Kensington Palace apartment represented in those first months. Not territory, memory, her photographs, her correspondence. The rooms in which her sons remembered her laughing, arguing, dressing for engagements, speaking on the telephone, waiting for them to return from school. For William and Harry, those rooms were not part of a royal public relations problem. They were where Mum had been. That is an entirely different thing, and Camilla's position in 1997 was extraordinarily delicate. Today it can be difficult to remember just how impossible her future appeared. There was no Queen Camilla, there was no wedding photograph beside Charles, no coronation, no decades of royal engagements. To much of the public, Camilla remained inseparable from the collapse of Charles and Diana's marriage. Even Queen Elizabeth appears to have struggled deeply with the relationship. According to biographer Tom Bower, Charles approached his mother in 1998 seeking acceptance for Camilla. Bower claimed the Queen angrily condemned the adultery and referred to Camilla as that wicked woman. The account comes from a biography rather than an official palace record, so it should be treated as reported testimony rather than a verbatim transcript. But the broader frostiness is consistent with what followed. Elizabeth did not immediately embrace Camilla publicly, and Charles's effort to normalize the relationship advanced gradually rather than overnight. That is the real barrier. It was not a locked door, it was legitimacy. And perhaps this is where people misunderstand Queen Elizabeth. The simplest version of the story says she disliked Camilla because she loved Diana. History is rarely that tidy. Elizabeth and Diana had experienced serious tensions. The Queen had ultimately urged Charles and Diana to divorce. Diana had publicly criticized the institution Elizabeth had spent her entire adult life protecting. Their relationship could contain sympathy, frustration, affection, disappointment, and duty at the same time. Those emotions do not cancel one another out. Elizabeth did not have to regard Diana as faultless to understand that Diana's death had changed the moral landscape. Nor did she have to hate Camilla permanently to believe that introducing her too quickly would be cruel, politically disastrous, or damaging to William and Harry. The Queen's defining instinct was usually continuity. Move carefully. Allow time. Do not force the country to accept today what it may accept naturally tomorrow. And after Diana died, time was exactly what Charles and Camilla needed. Consider the sequence. Diana dies in August 1997. Charles and Camilla do not immediately appear before Britain as an established royal couple. Instead, the relationship remains cautiously managed. Only in January 1999 do Charles and Camilla make their famous public appearance together at the Ritz in London. Even then, everything is calibrated. Arrival, departure, photographers, distance. Timing, it is almost choreography. Then in 2000, another small but enormously significant change occurs. Queen Elizabeth attends a gathering where Camilla is also present. Nothing dramatic happens. No proclamation, no embrace before TV cameras. But in royal language, presence can be a sentence. The Queen was willing to occupy the same social space. The wall had moved, not disappeared. Moved. Meanwhile, Diana's rooms were undergoing their own transformation. The private home Diana occupied at Kensington Palace did not simply become Camilla's new residence. Diana's former apartments 8 and 9 were eventually cleared and later repurposed, including for office and charitable uses, rather than becoming a replacement marital home for Charles and Camilla. That detail may appear administrative, it is not, because palaces understand symbols. A chair can be political, a title can be political, a doorway can be political, and a room can become almost sacred because of who is missing from it. The most explosive decision would have been to behave as though Diana had merely vacated a position. She hadn't. A woman had died, a mother had died, and millions of people believed something larger had been lost with her. Whatever came next had to acknowledge that this may therefore be the real meaning beneath the story that Elizabeth stopped Camilla entering Diana's room. The Queen could eventually accept Camilla, but acceptance could not begin with replacement. Camilla could have a future with Charles, but that future could not be constructed by occupying Diana's past. There is a difference, and Elizabeth, who understood symbolism better than almost anyone alive, would have understood precisely how dangerous that confusion could become. The question was never simply, will Charles marry Camilla? The deeper question was, can Camilla become part of the monarchy without requiring Britain to forget Diana? For years, there was no obvious answer. Charles and Camilla continued. Quietly at first, then publicly, the hostility gradually softened. Camilla developed her own charitable work. She avoided publicly styling herself Princess of Wales after marrying Charles, even though as his wife she was legally entitled to the feminine equivalent of his principal title. Instead, she became publicly known as the Duchess of Cornwall. That choice mattered because Princess of Wales remained overwhelmingly associated with Diana. Once again, the future was being constructed without directly occupying Diana's symbolic place. Then came April 9, 2005. Charles and Camilla married in Windsor. Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip did not attend the civil ceremony itself, but the Queen hosted the reception afterward at Windsor Castle. The royal family, another boundary had moved. The woman who once appeared almost impossible to incorporate into the royal family was now Charles's wife. But still the transformation was incomplete. The palace initially indicated Camilla would be known as princess consort when Charles became king. The word queen remained extraordinarily sensitive, because behind it stood another image. Diana, 24 years old, tiara, wedding dress. The woman millions had once expected would sit beside Charles on the throne. Almost 25 years after Diana's death, Queen Elizabeth made her final and most consequential intervention in Camilla's status. February 2022. The Queen was approaching the 70th anniversary of her accession. In a written message, Elizabeth addressed the future. When Charles became king, she said it was her sincere wish that Camilla should be known as Queen Consort. Think about the distance between those moments. Diana's death, public fury, Camilla almost untouchable. Reports of Elizabeth's anger, the Queen finally sharing public social space with Camilla. Marriage. Queen Consort. That did not happen because Diana was forgotten. It happened because nearly a quarter of a century had passed. William and Harry were grown men. The monarchy had changed. The public had changed. And Camilla had spent years establishing an identity within royal life that was no longer solely defined by Diana. Time had done what force could not, which brings us back to the doorway. A woman approaching, a room beyond it, a queen saying no. Did that precise cinematic confrontation happen exactly as later stories imagine it? There is no dependable archival evidence proving that it did. And Diana's history has been distorted too many times for another invented scene to be presented as documentation. But sometimes a legend survives because it compresses something real into a single image. And this one does, because there was a door Camilla could not immediately walk through. The door between private love and public legitimacy, between Charles's desire and the crown's acceptance, between becoming his partner and being perceived as Diana's replacement. And in the years immediately following Diana's death, Queen Elizabeth appears to have understood that those were not the same things. Not yet. Perhaps the most revealing object in this story, then, is not Diana's wedding ring, not a tiara, not even one of the millions of flowers placed outside Kensington Palace. It is a key, a small piece of metal that determines who may enter a room, because Diana spent years inside an institution where so much of life depended on invisible permission. Where to stand, what to say, when to speak, what title to use, which door to enter. And when her marriage collapsed, one of the most important things she retained was her home at Kensington Palace, a place where she could shut a door, a place where the woman known everywhere as the Princess of Wales could still possess something private, something hers. Then she died, and suddenly the meaning of those rooms belonged partly to her sons, partly to history, and partly to a public unwilling to watch her vanish. There is an irony here Diana might have understood. For years, she feared being written out. She believed the institution did not know what to do with her independence. She worried about losing her position, her voice, her place in the story. But after August 1997, erasing Diana became impossible. Camilla could eventually marry Charles. She could become Duchess of Cornwall. She could become Queen Consort. She could eventually be crowned queen beside him, but none of those things caused Diana to disappear. The opposite happened. Diana became fixed in memory, 36 years old forever. Walking through minefields, holding the hands of AIDS patients, crouching beside children, leaning toward people instead of waiting for them to approach her, laughing with William and Harry, closing the door of Kensington Palace behind her. And perhaps that is the reason the story of the Forbidden Room continues to feel believable, not because we possess a document proving Queen Elizabeth said, Camilla may not enter, but because the monarchy itself eventually behaved as though one principle had to be respected. Camilla could move forward. She could not move forward by pretending Diana had never been there. Elizabeth's eventual acceptance of Camilla was therefore not the deletion of Diana. It was something more complicated, a recognition that institutions survive by carrying contradictions. Diana could have been difficult for the monarchy and still deeply loved. Camilla could have caused pain and still build a later life of service. Charles could love Camilla and still carry responsibility for what happened inside his first marriage. Elizabeth could disapprove of Diana's methods and still publicly honor her after death. None of those truths requires the others to disappear. History becomes dishonest only when we demand that one woman must be erased for another to exist. Picture Kensington Palace one final time. Not the crowds outside, not the photographers. Inside, a corridor after the visitors have gone. A door closed, no dramatic music, no confrontation, only absence. A room in which someone once lived. That is what remains after all the titles and arguments. William and Harry did not lose a princess, they lost their mother. And whatever Queen Elizabeth's private feelings toward Diana had been, her televised words in September 1997 made one thing unmistakable. She understood that. Perhaps that was the boundary no one was ready to understand. It was never simply about keeping Camilla out. It was about refusing, at least in those first painful years, to let anyone walk into Diana's place and behave as though nothing had happened. Because Diana's place was no longer merely a room. It was memory. And memory does not surrender its keys so easily. If you remember Diana, not the tabloid version, not the TV dramatization, but the complicated woman behind them, write one word in the comments that you believe describes her best. Because stories like this deserve something more valuable than repetition. They deserve to be remembered correctly, and there was another object connected to Diana's final years that carried an even stranger meaning. A piece of jewelry, a private message, and a decision that looked ordinary until someone understood what Diana was really saying. That is where the next chapter begins.